Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chase Jardine, and it's my privilege to represent ASUU today. And as you all know, it's the Martin Luther King Celebration Week. And for ASUU, it's been a privilege for us to co-sponsor this week with the Martin Luther King Planning Committee and with the Office of Equity and Diversity. As we all know, diversity plays a huge role on our campus, and it's something that really helps and inspires all of us. So with that, a few reminders about events this week. Let's see, tomorrow at 10:45 in Osh in the Hinckley Caucus Room, there is a Hinckley Institute of Politics is putting on a forum called Reaffirming Equal Opportunity, Should the Utah Constitution Be Amended? And so if you could go to that, that'd be great. And on Thursday at noon, again in this ballroom, there's another keynote speaker. Just one thing that I'd like to point out, 50 years ago from this month actually, January of 1961, ASUU sponsored Dr. Martin Luther King speaking here on campus. Something that's actually not that well known on campus, I don't think, but he actually spoke here himself 50 years ago. So I think it's definitely appropriate to celebrate that as well as celebrate everything else that's going on this week. And with that, I want to introduce our president, President Michael K. Young.
Chase, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the ASUU's role in making this possible and presenting this. I'd also like to express special thanks to the Martin Luther King Advisory Committee here that does so much work to make this a terrific week for the university and remind us of so many core values that we as a university and we as members of this university community hold so dearly. This is our 27th annual Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. We've been doing this for 27 years now, and that's exciting because it allows us to remember that not only are we reminding ourselves of his heritage, but we're reminding ourselves of our own heritage, of how long this university has been deeply committed to these principles that he articulated so brilliantly, so eloquently, to bring us together to understand the need for all of us to allow room in the public and the private square for everybody to realize their full potential. And universities, if they stand for any proposition, stand profoundly and deeply for that proposition. It gives us an opportunity to remember not only his accomplishments and what he taught us, but equally importantly, what we learned from the lessons that he taught us in that great movement. So great thanks to that committee that has been operating. I look at the list; it represents about 3/4 of our campus constituencies, and that's very exciting. I'm particularly pleased today to introduce our keynote speaker. She and I have a connection that goes back more years than she probably will care to remember. When she was 13, and we were colleagues at Columbia University together, and I remember what a tremendous and wide swath that she cut across Columbia as she has done throughout the rest of her career. So it's a great pleasure to have you here on our campus, and we're just delighted to welcome you. I'll tell you just a little bit about her. Many of you may know a great deal about this, but she is a professor at both UCLA Law School and Columbia Law School, and is one of the nation's leading authorities on civil rights, black feminist legal theory, race, racism, and the law. And when I say leading authority, I don't say that lightly. Her articles have appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the National Black Law Journal, the Stanford Law Review, the Southern California Law Review, and the list goes on and on. She's really lectured widely as well, not only in the United States, but in Europe, in India, in Africa, in South America, extensively on this issue. So you have in your presence today not only a national authority on these matters, but indeed an international authority, a position that has become increasingly important as other parts of the world have discovered that they have to wrestle with the same things that we have in fact been wrestling with for 200 years in our nation. There was some period of time when much of the world looked at us as this benighted country struggling with its own past, only to discover they have their own past that they wrestle with as well. A world-renowned scholar on these areas. In fact, she's facilitated workshops on human rights not only in the United States, but as far-flung as Brazil and India, and working for constitutional court judges even in South Africa as they wrestle with these same issues. She was particularly influential, actually, in drafting the Equality Clause in the South African Constitution. In addition to that, she's authored the paper that was used for the UN Conference on Race and Gender Discrimination at the World Conference on Racism, and served as the rapporteur for that conference's expert group on gender and race, and coordinated the non-governmental organization group that ensured the inclusion of gender in that World Conference against racism and the declaration that resulted from that. But she's also worked extensively on issues pertaining to gender and race here in the United States and in the domestic arena, including violence against women, structural racial inequality, and affirmative action, all topics that are highly relevant to the political climate, the very charged political climate we find not only in Utah, but indeed throughout the United States. She's a member of the National Science Foundation's Committee to Research Violence Against Women, has consulted with leading foundations and social justice organizations and corporations to advance these causes and these race and gender equity initiatives as well. So it is a great pleasure to have her with us today. She's facilitated workshops on racial equality for literally hundreds of community leaders and organizations throughout the country, and has even started a project of international scholars under the auspices of the Aspen Institute, a network of scholars who are working in the field of social inclusion across 5 different continents. So with that, we're deeply honored to have a scholar as not only accomplished intellectually, who has set the agenda in such powerful ways, but who has taken that intellectual power and the force of that agenda into the lives of real people in real communities, not only in the United States, but indeed throughout the world. Professor Crenshaw, it's a great honor to have you with us.
Good afternoon. That's okay. Let's try it one more time. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. That's better. Well, it is an honor in so many ways to be here. I travel a fair amount, but I have to say that I rarely have the pleasure of being introduced by the president of the university. So I thank you so much for your kind words. And of course, it is an honor to be introduced by a former colleague. It really makes a difference to come someplace and to see a very friendly face. And the last honor is to have been invited back. So by my count, this may be my 4th visit here. And that means a lot. A lot of times people are very happy to have you and have you once. So to be invited back really means a lot to me. So I'd like to thank President Young for the very kind introduction. Also to all the organizers of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King celebration, both Dr. Malek, Ms. Salamoa, and Vice President Villapando for extending such a kind invitation for me to come. Now, I want to really get to what we're here to talk about, because this is an important moment for any of us who have concerns either personally or professionally about the challenge that we face along the long and arduous struggle for equity, particularly equity in education. It's no accident, of course, that the first and most significant opening in what had been apartheid in American society was through education. As Justice Earl Warren opined in his short, moving, and brilliant majority opinion in Brown versus Board of Education, education is the touchstone for democratic participation. The failure to educate fairly and equitably not only has consequences for individuals, but for society at large. And as Justice O'Connor opined nearly 50 years later in Grutter versus Michigan, Education is the key to demonstrate the visibly open pathways to leadership for people from underrepresented groups across the American spectrum. Education is long thought to be the key in achieving the dream of race and class equality in the United States. Now, for those who take seriously this goal, however, we cannot shy away from the candid assessment that these lofty aspirations are far from realized today. And if the challenges that we face aren't enough already, there's now on the horizon a new challenge. The very idea that our quest for equality in education and throughout society has been completed. Indeed, according to some, we as a society have arrived in the post-racial promised land. Now, I know this must come as a great surprise to many of you. You might have missed this declaration, the moment that we stepped out of history into the glorious land of milk and honey. So let me take you back to the moment where apparently we crossed this finish line. Now, perhaps you were there or you saw it on TV and you didn't realize that this is the moment at the inauguration of the first African American president in the United States, we officially became post-racial. And just in case you missed it at the time, the symbolism of the moment was punctuated by the appearance of Martin Luther King, whose appearance at that moment was like the yellow flag at the finish line, proclaiming that at that moment, not only had Obama arrived, but we all had arrived too. And while we might forget the excitement of that moment a few years ago, the thrilling way that all Americans seemed to invest in that transition, thinking it had trans-historical significance, now when we look back, can we really fairly assess us to be a post-racial society? Now, of course, my question begs the question, what do we mean when we say post-racial? What is the word post doing in post-racial? Now, is there a particular set of social relations that have come about that we can fairly say are non-racial? Or does post-racial mark a temporal moment, a finish line that we've crossed, perhaps by the mere passage of time? Is post-racial a provable reality in the here and now? Or is it an insistent denial that race is here? Is post-racial merely a dream? Is it a dream accomplished? Or is it a dream deferred? What is post-racial? Now, my hunch is that most of you who gathered to honor the legacy of Martin Luther King might be, well, skeptical about this post-racial proclamation. And my further hunch is that you would not be alone in wondering what exactly does it all mean for the work that we're all interested in doing and the aspirations that we set for ourselves as a society. Now, I suppose no one would be more puzzled by this declaration of the dream realized than the dreamer himself, Martin Luther King. How ironic, I thought, that his image, his words, his being would be called forth to punctuate a claim that would be hard for him to fathom. Now, such is the plight of martyrs, no doubt, often forced by death to silently authorize circumstances that are at odds with the vision for which they gave their lives. But what if Dr. King could speak? What if all this joyful celebration and the magnificent claims that are being made as his name somehow cracked open a celestial separation between the world of the living and that world just beyond, so that Dr. King, awakened by all the trumpeting that we have arrived, could actually join us? What might his reaction be upon hearing that we've reached the post-racial promised land? I was thinking about this as I was preparing these comments and sort of drifted into some deep meditation about what that conversation might sound like. And it started to sort of come into my head, little pieces of the conversation, bits and pieces at first, sort of like I was tuning into some cosmic channel. And then I could finally hear the conversation come in, sort of like HBO when the program finally comes on. And so at first I heard news flashes from CNN. Politicians call for the end of the Voting Rights Act. Citing Obama's victory, there is no need for further protections today, said one story. Then this, Congress is set to enact the Colorblind Education Act, repealing all ethnic studies programs, minority student organizations, outreach, even repealing Black History Month, says its principal supporter. In a post-racial world, these harbingers of the past only encourage us to think in terms of race. And finally this, Ward Connerly, set to appear on CNN in a live television interview on Martin Luther King Day with a special message from Dr. King. Now that we've arrived, Dr. King's legacy can be made real through the elimination of all race-conscious affirmative action programs, policies that pay attention to race. The day of racial preference is over. We have overcome. Now, somewhere between the here and the thereafter, Dr. King was peering through the mist. From the levity of the scene, it appears that a party was going on just behind him. The announcement had just been made that we living creatures have finally worked through all the racial drama going on down here. The generals of the warring sides of our racial history are laying down arms, and hardworking soldiers of the social justice movements are kicking up their feet. Cesar Chavez and Malcolm X are laughing it up with Barry Goldwater. Fannie Lou Hamer and Betty Friedan have taken the day off. Geronimo has invited the cavalry over for a quick celebratory bite. They've apparently all heard the news. We've reached the post-racial promised land. Now, Dr. King is pensive, though, perhaps not so much skeptical as just curious. So just where is this post-racial and how did they get there, he asked Thurgood Marshall in the midst of a big bear hug and an awkwardly attempted high five. Marshall shrugged, who knows, but who can say how we got there? But at least we could say, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. And he walked off. Now, back on the planet Earth, the new reporter on CNN, not someone we'd all know, but a familiar voice of conventional wisdom, all wrapped up in congeniality and friendliness, is sitting in for the recently retired Larry King. Let's call him Barry King, youngest son of the talk show giant Larry King. He's interviewing a stream of guests about how King's dream has finally been realized. Little did he know that a Twilight Zone moment was about to happen. Apparently, after the zillionth time Dr. King's name has been invoked to advance some sort of post-racial agenda, cosmic law allows the man to appear himself. And it was just in time for Martin Luther King. Having grown increasingly curious with Barry's prior guest, Ward Connerly, King was more than ready to materialize in the green room. Of course, Barry must have thought he was seeing things when his current guest, Nancy Pelosi, began morphing into someone else, like in Michael Jackson's Black or White video, first into a white man, then into a black man, and then finally into MLK himself. Newsman that he was, Barry didn't skip a beat. This was going to be the scoop of the century. Like a chip off the old block, nothing was too incredulous for Barry King. Man bites dog, king in the flesh, sensational news. It's all good news to him. So here they were, two kings, Barry and Martin, man alone in the studio while the festivities continued. So tell us how it feels, Dr. King, to know that your dream has come true. We're done with this race stuff once and for all, and we have you to thank for it. It must be pretty thrilling. Well, actually, Dr. King began, I was hoping that you could tell me all about it. I've been to the mountaintop, and I knew that one day we would arrive, but I'm here to learn just how we got here. Would you be kind enough to paint a picture for me, please? Well, Dr. King, Barry began, I'm not a specialist in these matters, but I can certainly share with you what I know. But here, take a look at this. It's called a computer monitor. Just think of it like a newspaper on TV sort of thing. It's just going to be scrolling through some things in the background while we talk, give you an idea of some of the things that went on since you left us. Just hit this button to pause on anything that catches your attention, and we'll give you a good idea of why we're so excited around here. So Barry turned the monitor around so Dr. King could see it. He jabbed at the screen a few times, but after a puzzled glance at the keyboard, he leans into Barry. He really wants to hear the story, not read about it. Well, Barry, says Dr. King, I heard from your guest, Ward Connerly, that we've arrived, that my dream has become a reality, that we no longer need to worry about racial injustice. We can put all that behind us. So in my dream, the day would come when our children are walking hand in hand together. So tell me about education, Barry. Tell me about how it all happened in the schools. So is it like the Supreme Court promised in 1963 that we would reach the day of full integration where there are no black schools, no white schools, just schools? We're in the promised land now. So we must not only have just schools, but just schools. Dr. King, we can't really say we've got just schools or even just schools. We still have schools, Dr. King, but while they're not segregated anymore, they're not exactly integrated either. Now, I noticed here Dr. King frowned a bit. I'm guessing the distinction between not integrated and not segregated was probably as bizarre to him as that iPhone in Barry's pocket or the internet that was feeding him 40 years of news. Not segregated, but not integrated either. So in my dream, the children are hand in hand. How can this happen if they're neither segregated nor integrated? Well, Dr. King, let me put it this way. It's what we call virtual integration. They're together here. Because, we're all just Americans now, not black, not brown, not white, not yellow or red. Well, if we're all just Americans, why are most children still attending schools in which they are the majority race? Why is it that black school children throughout the states are as segregated in many places in 2010 as they were in 1964? Why is it that 56 years after the Supreme Court struck down school segregation for Latino students, they are more segregated now than they were then? What does any of this have to do with my dream? Well, Dr. King, your dream is realized because parents are choosing where they want to send their children to school. People choose which neighborhoods they live in, what schools they attend, the futures that they'll have. At the end of the day, that's what you were really protesting, right? The inability of minority parents to choose their destiny for their children. Well, Dr. King said, actually, this business about choice was what we used to hear in the 50s and 60s by white parents trying to push back the integration of the schools. In fact, school districts frequently turn to these freedom of choice plans to defeat integration. The Supreme Court finally struck down these freedom of choice plans and required school boards to take affirmative steps to dismantle these dual school systems, root and branch. The court made it clear. The goal was to eliminate segregation, root and branch. How can the Supreme Court be in the way after all of these years? Well, sir, I guess you might say the whole root and branch thing was somewhat of an overstatement. Just like weed killer, it promises to get them out all the way down to the roots, and sure, your yard looks pretty good for a few weeks, and then next spring, there they are again. What are you going to do? Segregation is like that. The Supreme Court made big promises, and it inspired big fights. Court-ordered remedies like busing, magnet schools, special programs, the works. And racial isolation began to drop, along with the achievement gap, especially in the South. But, segregation is a pesky thing, something you can get working well, and then before you know it, it's back to the same old way it was before. So the courts eventually said, look, if you've done the best you can do, we'll just shake hands on it and call it a day. So many school districts were released from desegregation requirements once they made, now let me see, what did they call this? Oh yes, a good faith effort to eliminate the effects of segregation to the extent practicable. So no, not root and branch. Of course, like those dandelions, the segregated schools pop right back, pretty much like we knew they would. But look, the beauty of the handshake is those racially separated schools aren't considered segregated anymore. That's been eliminated to the extent practicable. Well, Dr. King, these school districts that fought to desegregate tooth and nail, those that relegated young minds to inferior educations while spending hundreds of millions of dollars resisting integration, they ultimately won? I never thought I'd see the day. Well, Dr. King, you'd be surprised how many of your former adversaries have actually attempted to carry your work forward. As you and others predicted, once school districts finally did integrate, many saw the benefits of increased achievement for minority students and greater levels of cross-racial exposure. The school board of Louisville, Kentucky, for example, desperately wanted to continue their desegregation plans, as did the school district in Seattle. But now, at least a plurality on the Supreme Court believes that the use of race to diversify schools is as poisonous as the use of race to segregate schools. In fact, Clarence Thomas, sorry, you don't know him, long story, he says there's a moral equivalence between the two. A moral equivalence between segregation and integration. I just cannot understand what you're saying. Are you saying that the highest court in the land, the court that declared that segregation damaged the hearts and the minds of children in a way that would never be undone, the court that said that poor Linda Brown, who walked past well-equipped schools in her neighborhood to go to an underfunded school cabined off for colored people, is now saying that little white children in their modern neighborhood schools and Linda Brown across the tracks were each being harmed by segregation in the same way? That's as ridiculous as Plessy versus Ferguson, when the Supreme Court upheld segregation by saying that Negroes and whites were equally affected by segregation. Negroes couldn't sit in white cars, whites couldn't sit in Negro cars. Now, everyone knew that segregation wasn't symmetrical. It meant keeping the other down, robbed of opportunity and dignity. I believed that the specious kind of argument died when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. Sir, just a hint. Your people are called African Americans now. We're post-racial, so you could get in a lot of trouble for using a term that's, say, outdated. A senator got in some pretty hot water about that a few years ago. But yeah, you've got the idea. Taking account of race, that's old racialism that harms whites and non-whites alike. Ignoring race, now that's post-racial. So yeah, Linda Brown in the black school and the nameless little white kids in the white school, they were all victimized by a policy that took their race into account in deciding where they should attend school. Post-racial means colorblind. It doesn't matter whether the goal is to segregate or to integrate the schools in post-apartheid America. The use of race is equally off the table. So let me get this straight, says Dr. King, returning now to his monitor to look at the statistics on segregation. We have black schools, we have white schools, we have Latino schools. Many of the black and Latino schools are poorly funded, isolated, failing schools, and these schools are increasing in numbers. But we can't do anything to integrate these schools because now we're living in a post-racial promised land where race is off the table. How can we possibly be over race when an institution as important as the public school system remains nearly as racially segregated today as it was in the 50s? La, 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 Barry's putting his hands over his ears. King is puzzled. What are you doing? Sir, I'm just trying to talk over you. It's what we do now. It's the new post-racial rule. Well, actually there are 3 rules. See no race, hear no race, say no race. After all, we're post-racial. Well, King says, how would you know if we're really post-racial if you can't see, hear, or talk about race or racism? Barry, well, that's the point, sir. We don't want to hear, see, or talk about it. And when we don't, most folks feel pretty okay about that. In fact, my earlier guest, Warren Connerly, proposed a constitutional amendment, Prop 54, to eliminate the collection of all racial data. Now, I know those Californians, they do some pretty crazy things, but a lot of folks thought that was a pretty good idea. People thought if you take away the ability to measure racial disparities, then you take away the ability to fight about them. In Arizona, they've even enacted a law to prohibit ethnic studies programs and textbooks that reflect our troubled racial history. How do you solve the current effects of, say, segregation, appropriation of land, border wars, and all that? Well, it seems simple, right? Stop talking about them. Problem solved. Racial to post-racial in lickety-split time. Who could ask for anything more? So King says, how in the world is it possible to understand the source of these racial disparities that I'm seeing here without learning about the history of how they came about? How would you understand, for example, the large white suburban class, how it came about, without knowing that the federal government spent $120 billion to create it through the Federal Housing Act? And through racial discrimination in those very policies, limited this incredible handout virtually solely to white Americans. Less than 1% of that $120 billion went to any people of color. How would you know that the tremendous growth of the white professional class was made possible by the GI Bill, and that this opportunity was a stepping stone into the largely white middle class that most African Americans and Latinos did not have access to? How would people today know that the Social Security Act, which excluded industries that were heavily populated by Latinos and African Americans, domestics and farm workers, continues to constitute a disproportionate burden on poor families who now have to take care of grandparents? How would they know that the roots of the mortgage meltdown, health disparities, education deficits, all have roots in policies, some of them intentional, some of them not, that created and maintained a racial system? These things don't go away with time. In fact, they often get worse. Well, sir, says Barry, there's a dominant sentiment that paying attention to these facts just heightens the demand for racial preference. And of course, that contradicts post-racialism. That's why people are moved by people like Ward Connerly and others who they believe that it's best to let bygones be bygones. Racial preferences aren't the answer. Fair play is the way to go. You know, Dr. King said, I can see the effects of this efforts to censor our own history. This preference argument is the oldest one in the book. In the immediate aftermath of slavery, our own president said that modest civil rights protections against discrimination were actually preferences for African Americans. People even thought that freeing the slaves was a preference for African Americans. In the 50s, white store owners and waiters thought that equal treatment was discrimination against them. Anyone who takes as a given an unequal status quo will see efforts to dismantle that unfairness as a preference. So you're telling me that we haven't gotten beyond those specious arguments of the 1950s? Well, sir, across the nation, there's a move afoot to do precisely that. And I have to say, you know, maybe there's a little overkill here. I mean, gee whiz, this Connerly fellow is taking this campaign to Utah. I mean, Utah isn't what I would think would be in the middle of the battleground over affirmative action. It's not as though the white citizens are taking it on the chin there, you know what I mean? But yeah, there's the sentiment, sir. And to some, Ward Connerly represents the courage that you demonstrated. Although as a journalist, I do have to say that he's not just a civil rights advocate. Interestingly, he also works as a lobbyist for contracting firms who have contributed substantial resources to rolling back affirmative action in at least 5 different states. I can't even wrap my head around this. So let me get this straight. The solution to racial disparities in school funding, in healthcare, in profiling, in early deaths, in environmental diseases, in unemployment, in land loss, in property foreclosures, in family dissolution and homelessness is simply to stop asking, stop noticing, stop reporting. Well, yeah, that's the ticket to post-racial, sir. And you'd probably be impressed with all the foundations and politicians that now march under your banner. It's a list of the old civil rights juggernaut, the anti-civil rights juggernaut, and their intellectual descendants. They call themselves the American Civil Rights Institute. They call themselves the American Civil Rights Coalition. It's like tearing a page out of history. You're everybody's hero now, Dr. King. So the post-racial solution to the continuing legacy of racism is to ignore race altogether. That's what you think living the dream means. We'll ignore racial injustice and let it fester. Sir, please, you can get into trouble for saying that there's still a race problem. Well, okay, let me clarify that a bit. You can get in trouble for saying that racial problems have something to do with racism. That's called the politics of racial grievance. Now, you wouldn't want to be in the category of these race mongers. So King says, I'm profoundly confused. Advocacy is out, but you still can talk about race in other ways? Oh, yeah, sure. I know that's a head scratcher. Okay, so watch carefully. I'll give you a few examples to explain. So Obama, black guy living in the White House, I'll fill you in on that in a moment. He's running for president, first black man to have a shot. But let's face it, you don't look at him and think American presidential material. So he said, hey, to the American voters, don't be as scared away from the fact that my name sounds funny or my face doesn't look like the one on a dollar bill. Vote for me anyway, because I'm the best candidate for the job. Now, what would the post-racial problem with this be? Says Barry, isn't it obvious, Dr. King? He's suggesting that race might have something to do with white voters' reluctance to have voted for him. He's playing the race card, don't you see? That's against the rules. Can't do that. I can't imagine that wouldn't be true, said Dr. King. In fact, I can't imagine that there wasn't plenty of evidence to suggest that color would be a factor in overcoming and winning the hearts and minds of white voters. Barry, okay, here's the deal. That's true. But in a post-racial world, we're in an as-if world. We're supposed to act like it doesn't matter. And Obama broke the rules by humming a few tunes from We Shall Overcome. It was good back in the day, but it's not really appropriate now. So you're saying that he ran a post-racial campaign and he won? Well, to be honest, Dr. King, he wouldn't have won without white Americans going door to door in Ohio and in Pennsylvania and talking about race, talking about his agenda, talking about the stereotypes that might have gotten in the way with them voting for someone who represented what they considered to be their interests, honestly, face to face about race and racism. So Dr. King says, help me out here. What I'm hearing is that we dream a world in our lives that our private discourse repudiates every day. So if that's post-racial, we seem to be moving at a glacier's pace away from the past. Well, it wouldn't be quite right to say all talk of race is being pushed off the table, if I were to be honest. There's still plenty to talk about. Well, take affirmative action, for example. Here on this Newsweek cover, is affirmative action still necessary? We certainly put black folks out there and talk about race front and center there. Dr. King, well, who is this young fellow? Is he a civil rights leader, a student activist? Was he a plaintiff in one of the cases? Who is he? Well, actually, sir, he had nothing to do with any of the cases at all. In fact, he's not even a student. He's a model. Handsome fellow, though, isn't he? The idea, though, was to demonstrate, create an illustration of what people think affirmative action is about. And you can get a picture of at least what the editors thought here. Affirmative action is about race. It's not about gender. It's about African Americans. It's not about other people of color. And if you look at his sort of nice clothing and his attitude, it's also telling you that affirmative action is about privileging the middle class, not the poor. So people were really critical of this, don't get me wrong. They pointed out that affirmative action beneficiaries represent a broad group of Americans and that it has particularly affected by lifting the class status of generations of people of color. But my point, sir, is that we do talk about race when it's important to focus on outdated policies Or on personal responsibility, that's another one. Take Senator Obama on Father's Day. Now, he did a great job there talking about personal responsibility and black fathers. He really told black fathers that a lot of them were being irresponsible. Now, that's a speech that went over pretty well. So Dr. King says, I am more and more lost. Talking about fatherhood and responsibility as though these were distinctively black problems, doesn't that break the post-racial rule? Well, sir, why would it? The rule is pretty much not applied to discussions about really important problems. I mean, there are some racial things that we have to talk about, wouldn't you agree? Like crime, family breakdown. The really big one nowadays is intellectual underdevelopment and racial achievement gaps. Yeah, when we talk about why public schools aren't doing well, schools with people of color in them, we've got a full house of racial discourse here, from cultural deficits to motivational deficits, from senses of entitlement to even hip hop. That's okay, sir. No post-racial rules are being violated here. So let me understand this one more time. I'm not a social scientist, of course, but I'm assuming that in order to highlight racial differences in the achievement gap, all the other conditions have been equalized, such as funding equity, teacher competence, school conditions, curricular relevance, exclusion, other forms of disparity. I'm assuming that the myriad ways that social exclusion intersects and compounds inequality, all of this is accounted for before we start talking about race as the source of achievement gaps. Well, sir, that's a different issue. There are huge disparities in school financing. We don't talk about that when we talk about achievement gaps. Connerly and his associates seem to argue that if we eliminate affirmative action in higher education, then more attention will be paid to fixing public schools. Some people said it was mixing apples and oranges, but hey, the argument worked. But there's been little effort to equalize public education, nor to reflect on the standards and practices that some say come straight from the turn of the last century, when the potential of entire racial groups was measured by standardized tests that posited the inherent inequality between races. So King says, it seems to me this entire achievement gap problem doesn't take into account the way that the system is structured in a way that excludes certain children. Then after permitting processes of exclusion to do their effect, the final insult is to lay responsibility for the consequences at their feet, telling them that they're expecting preferential treatment to demand an educational policy that works for them. Well, sir, that would be a fair assessment if there were a commitment to achieving fairness and equity in these measures. But you should know, education is not a fundamental right. And indeed, there's no right against class discrimination in public education either. The court saw to that in San Antonio versus Rodriguez, where it declared that the Constitution did not prohibit funding policies that discriminate against poor and immigrant children. So let me see if I can understand this. What post-racialism permits us to interrogate and what it doesn't. So performance disparities can be talked about as inherent characteristics of children, whether it's cultural, cognitive, social, or whatever. But the legacy of race in structuring opportunities, funding, the internal dynamics of education itself, those are embargoed. We can't talk about that. Well, I'd be the first to admit that it's a bit of a contradiction, but we pretty much decided that all this talk about racism is just, well, counterproductive, and it makes people feel kind of bad. So if I may be as bold to say, sir, it isn't a far cry from how your holiday is often celebrated. In fact, the very first commission, the MLK Commission, headed by notable civil rights people, recommended that the day not be used to criticize or politicize American society, but to live the dream of a world in which race doesn't matter. So now it's MLK Day every day. Now we're truly post-racial, so your holiday gives us a great opportunity to congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. Well, Dr. King says, I have to say, I'm having a difficult time understanding exactly how far we have come. What I've heard so far is this. Our schools are as segregated as ever before, but the good news is no one can use race to classify students. We still have racial disparities that are profound along every data point we can think of, but the solution to that is to stop collecting racial data. We elected an African American as president, so that proves we don't have to talk about race. But it took a massive campaign of talking about race to make it happen. We can talk about races performing badly, particularly if that's not race mongering, but we can't talk about racism because, well, that's race mongering. All this is supposed to be part of my dream. Well, in a word, sir, yes. And you are the one who encouraged people to think, not in terms of skin color, but in terms of the content of our characters. And that's what post-racialism is all about. Ignoring skin color, paying attention to people. But I also said quite clearly, when we went to the March on Washington, we were going to cash a check, a promissory note, one that promised structural and institutional change, a note that would give all Americans an opportunity to make good on the promises of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Something more was necessary than to muffle all discourse about race. I called on us to do something affirmative, to dismantle structural chains that limit the life chances of people, to make good on this national debt that only grows rather than lessens over time. Barry, well, surely you should know that there have been a few who agree with you. Gloria Ledson-Billings also mobilizes this idea that we're not looking at an gap, but an education debt. And Justice Blackmun quite clearly said, to get beyond racism, you have to take account of race. But there are others who disagree with you, sir. Justice Scalia, who now sits on the Supreme Court, says it pretty clearly. There is no creditor race, there is no debtor race, there's only the human race. So post-racialism means that we're just beyond the concerns that you focused on. You know, Dr. King, I have to be honest, it's been over 50 years. And since you so brilliantly introduced the notion of the promissory note in your I Have a Dream speech, maybe it might be helpful for you to think about post-racialism as a declaration of bankruptcy. It's not a temporary insufficient funds note that might suggest that a settlement might be forthcoming if you just resubmit the note again. It's a note that says the debt is wiped clean, period. It's just like what ordinary people do when they can't pay their debts. So, you know, you go and you sit it out for 7 years in a penalty box, and hey, after that, you're good to go. No creditors, no debtors, you can start all over. So post-racialism is like bankruptcy. We're overburdened, there's no more social justice capital to pay that promissory note, so we're filing for post-racialism. We've sat in the penalty box for the appropriate amount of time, and now the debt's removed. It's time to move on. But time is neutral. It seems post-racialism thinks that just the ticking clock is enough, that post simply means enough time has passed. Barry, but clearly, sir, it's reasonable. I mean, you can look around and you can see that professionals in the middle class in particular, there's been a substantial growth in their participation. That's change you can believe in. Plus, any post-racial plans like the ones you proposed are really unpopular among white majority. With respect, at the end of the day, isn't this what you were always trying to get at, Dr. King? At the end of the day, what I'm about is racial justice. I've always been explicit in supporting affirmative actions, positive steps, race conscious and otherwise, to remove obstacles that make equal opportunity a myth rather than a reality. Well, Barry says, exasperated, your Marshall Plan never happened, Dr. King. And if it were to happen now, it would have to be colorblind. And just like Justice Roberts says, how are we ever going to get beyond race if we keep paying attention to it? Doesn't he have a point when he says to stop discriminating on the basis of race? We have to stop discrimination on the basis of race. MLK is now confused. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's like saying that the way to get rid of asbestos-linked diseases is to stop looking for or seeing or saying the word asbestos. It's like saying that the problem of asbestos is that we're getting sick because we're paying attention to it. So we shouldn't look for it. We shouldn't develop tools to protect ourselves from it. If we don't see it, it won't harm us. Well, this is a fairy tale that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this just is a senseless way to think about any problem that you really care about. It is flying blind. You're destined for disaster if you're confronted with a problem that you cannot name or correct. Well, sir, what can I tell you? People have been debating this for a long time, on race consciousness in particular, and our conservatives and our liberals now agree. Affirmative action compromises equal opportunity by giving colored people a head start. Now, they disagree about why or whether this should go on. Liberals, like your friend LBJ, say you can't bring a man in change to a starting line and expect him to run the same race. Conservatives say giving a head start isn't the solution. It isn't fair to the runner, nor others she's running with. They agree that affirmative action, it is the damaged runner who crosses the finish line first, but they disagree about whether this is defensible or not. Martin Luther King, and this would be the exact problem with the post-racial argument. That liberals and conservatives disagree isn't significant. What is significant is what they agree about. And I part company with my liberal colleagues here. If you listen closely, they both think the problem is damaged runners, while I think the problem is damaged tracks. The equal opportunity race has never been fair and square from the beginning. Race-conscious intervention wouldn't be seen as unfair or an unjustified preference if we all focused on the damaged lanes, not the damaged people. We have to remove the effects of these obstacles and balance the preferences that are on the tracks. Preferences for people on the people mover, people who are born to families of privilege. I mean, it may be apocryphal, but bear with me. I'm going to stretch my credulity, but I'm going to try to make a point. Let's suppose, hypothetically, there's a son of privilege, one who does fairly poorly at an elite school. But because of his ties and his social connections, he earns a slot, say, at Yale University. And let's say our hypothetical son of privilege does a bit better there. He earns, say, a C average. And then, due to the grace of wealth, wins a slot at Harvard Business School. And let's just stretch the imagination one more step. Let's just say he goes on to create spectacular failures in the world of business. And thanks to his name, he wins the best job in America. He becomes president of the United States. Now, I know it's hyperbole, to be sure. Who could ever imagine that happening? But my point is this. If it were to happen, no one would ever see this as the negative consequences of preferential treatment. But that's certainly what it would be, wouldn't it? Preferential treatment? I understand what you're saying, Sir Versus, but we're getting short on time. Time and silence are deadly combinations, Dr. King says. It seems to me you're confused about post-racialism. It's not a temporal concept. It isn't an accomplishment. It's not a place, and it's not a time. It sounds to me it's another way to wrap the challenges we face in a manner that allows us not to think about them and to silence those who do. I remember this phenomenon during the Montgomery bus boycott. At that time, the language was the language of gradualism. One day our time would come. The purveyors of these approaches, my fellow ministers, called me to task for being an advocate. But as I said in 1962, and I'll say it again, it's good to be maladjusted to an injustice. I don't mind marching to the beat of racial justice, even if I'm the only one in the parade. Barry is now thankful that his hour with Dr. King is apparently winding down as his image is starting to fade. Well, Dr. King, we're really out of time now. Do you have any parting words for us? Dr. King, it seems to me that the language of gradualism has matured into a language of arrival. Back then they told us, don't rock the boat. Now they're telling you there is no boat. We have arrived. But this is a fantasy, one that we will regret if someone doesn't wake us up. Who history calls on to tell its truths remains to be seen. King's image began to fade just as I heard the stirrings of my cell phone urging me to wake up and finish my speech. But something that Dr. King said stuck with me. The idea is that it's not unequal to pay attention to inequality, to reimagine the equal opportunity race, not in fictional coloring terms, but in the true way in which race, gender, and other forms of inequality litter the equal opportunity race. I looked down on my scribbles, you know, that crazy stuff you write when you're falling asleep. And what I saw was actually a visual imagery of everything Dr. King had said. So, if I might, I'd like to share with you, in conclusion, the imagery that Dr. King's vision represents. Yes. So let me end with a description, and during the question and answer, I will play it with the help of any technical assistance that I can get. So in the end, what Dr. King draws our attention to is the equal opportunity race. The race begins with some runners off on the races, and other runners are still stuck in their tracks, waiting year after year, decade after decade before they could finally take a lap, by policies, practices that exclude them from the race and put them outside of the opportunity grid. Practices that we know of, such as Indian removal and genocide, manifest destiny, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, slavery, disenfranchisement, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and many others. All the while, other runners continue to run around and around to accumulate wealth, opportunity, while they pass on to younger runners as they continue to make laps, those advantages that they were able to win for themselves. By the time the stalled runners are finally allowed to take their mark and enter the race, it's 1964. Generations have passed before them, leaving hundreds laps behind. But it's not just the past discrimination that burdens the race as they go round and round in Dr. King's imagery. They're stymied by current forms of exclusion. Their past limited by poor schools, by profiling, by standardized tests, by segregation, by healthcare disparities ending in early death. At the end of the race, Dr. King has an image of his Marshall Plan, a tractor that comes onto the track to remove these barriers and obstacles. This tractor, this removal of obstacles, is not a preference, it's not reverse discrimination. It is equal opportunity. It is the investment and the interventions that are necessary to take us to the true post-racial world that is worthy of Dr. King's legacy. Thank you very much. So I understand there's a little time for question, and maybe by the time we're done, we can see this little animation.
There are two microphones at either end of the stage here. If anybody would like to ask a question, we ask you to please use a microphone.
Professor Crenshaw, thank you so very much for those really illuminating remarks. I think particularly in a political climate and context where it's very difficult to give voice to race, and be heard in a way that can be understood. Your presentation has done that wonderfully. I wonder if you might comment, because you've looked at these issues in other contexts, in international contexts, about the distinction between voicing equality, saying it with name, and formal equality only, and what would be required to have a conversation about substantive equality. Because perhaps that's a part of the disconnect, and that's often difficult to convey.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, one of the benefits, I think, of being able to internationalize the conversation is that one can see that some of the challenges that we face here in actually making that connection are challenges that people all over the world who come from historical contexts that are similar to ours are also facing. So in Brazil, in South Africa, immediately after the end of apartheid, the rhetoric of formal equality, we've arrived, actually set in that particular place. So it's pretty clear that people have a sense that inequality is solely based on moments of unequal treatment, treating people who are the same as though they're different. What we have a hard time with is showing the other aspect of inequality, treating people who are historically, socially, institutionally differently situated as though they are the same. That's also a form of inequality that we generally have a harder time with, at least with respect, I think, to race. So some of what I try to do in this talk and with the animation is to show both the idea of people all running, but some people are running in lanes where it's completely unencumbered, and other people are running in lanes that are completely littered with a whole range of social and economic barriers. Treating those runners as though they are the same is formal equality, but it's not substantive equality. It is obvious that not removing those obstacles will mean that the winners of the race are the ones who just happen to be in the lanes that were unencumbered. So I try to figure out ways of making theoretical, legal, and philosophical debates about equality more accessible to people so they're easily understandable, and then people can apply that and understand how it shapes the conditions in the lives that they lead.
Professor Crenshaw, thank you for coming and speaking with all of us, especially Tanya in the story format, so we kept more people awake. I wanted to ask very quickly, you talked about the track and about trying to level it out and make it more of an equal playing field. And at one point you discussed the issue of financing for these different schools. And No Child Left Behind went up, and of course I started laughing. But I was wondering if you could bring up maybe another instance that I might not have caught, where we can focus on to try and level out that playing field more in education, financing, but maybe a couple more ways that we could do this.
Sure, thank you. So there's a whole raft of policies and debates. One that I also hinted at was the use of standardized tests, which as you know, is one of the key components of No Child Left Behind. The idea being that if we apply standardized tests to all children and insist on basic achievement measures, no child will be left behind. And I think there are plenty of reasons to think that at least some people actually believe that one standard does ensure that educational resources are directly targeted to people who need them most. But the problem is one of the problems of colorblindness, assuming that there is a standard, that standardized tests are not themselves measures of reproducing dynamics over a long history of using measures of intellectual measures in racially specified ways. In many instances, these standardized tests correlate not to performance, not to anything in particular, except for socioeconomic status, and in higher education to race as well. As long as we can't look behind what we consider to be race-neutral measures, and if we don't historicize them. So the SAT actually was the product of a eugenicist organization and movement. We don't understand that now, and we act like, well, why are there so many consistent disparities? Well, if you look at the tool and how it was created and what its assumptions are, there's more continuity than discontinuity in the use of these tools and measures. So it's one of many things that we have to be much more cognizant of. And I guess to put a point on it, one of the things that's so bothersome and worrisome to me about what's happening in Arizona, that many of the tools that we need to be able to see why institutional practices that look colorblind now do not create equal opportunities is we don't have the history behind them. And this attempt to remove history is an attempt to naturalize these disparities, to take away the tools that people have to be able to name, to critique, to organize, and to change, right? So if you can't win the argument on its own terms, you take away the tools that people have to be able to actually engage in the actual fight. That's what Proposition 54 would have done in California. If you can't measure racial disparities in the schools, then you can't fight for racial justice. These are the kind of moves that I think are typical of a post-racial moment, but they're also particularly lethal in our efforts and our hopes to be able to continue having intergenerational struggle for racial justice.
Hi, Dr. Crenshaw. My question is twofold. One, as we face this initiative to eliminate affirmative action here in our state, first of all, do you know what programs have gone away in places like California and Michigan? And then secondly, can you just give us some specific talking points that we might want to use as we do
Wonderful. All right, thanks for that question. I was just talking to one of my hosts coming over here about what this initiative or what these interventions actually represent. And a lot of people actually think that, there's a lot of ambivalence about affirmative action. If we just take that off the table, we can all work together on the things we all agree around. So we all agree about equal access, and we all agree that we want a more integrated society. So let's just take the one thing off the table that we want to fight about all the time, and then focus on schools, and focus on capacity, and focus on preparation. That's the argument. That's not the reality. The reality is, when these initiatives have been passed, this is just the beachhead that allows for arguments about a whole wide range of things that people would never guess would have been incorporated in the language of now we're against preference. So I was mentioning that ethnic studies programs would be targeted by those in states that have this anti-affirmative action initiative. People thought, that's crazy. Affirmative action preference has nothing to do with an area of study. Well, guess what? It turns out that essentially preference means color consciousness. Anything that can be said to be a departure from race neutrality, color blindness, anything that draws attention to race is seen as violating the notion that we have no preference and no discrimination by the Constitution. So in lots of states, mine included, there have been grumbles, sometimes attacks, so far not yet fully successful, to eliminate affirmative action, to eliminate ethnic studies, to eliminate alumni associations that do outreach to alumni of color, to bring them into the university to mentor young students of color. There are efforts to eliminate student organizations, to eliminate student programs, even to eliminate programs like this because they draw attention to race. So a whole wide range of policies and practices come under this idea of preferential treatment. We also talk a lot to women because many women, particularly mothers, particularly the soccer moms, don't think this issue is really about them, right? And much of the campaign is often targeted at trying to say, we know what you think affirmative action is about. You think it's about that picture on Newsweek, but actually it's about working mothers. It's actually about how it is that two earner families have been able to reach the middle class. It's because of affirmative action opportunities that were made available for women, especially Anglo-American women in the workforce. So the idea was to try to reach out and say, this isn't just about race, this is gender as well. In the 4 states in which this has been tried, it has not been a tremendously successful strategy. In California, in Washington, and in Michigan, Anglo-American women voted for the Connerly Initiative at about 55 to 56 percentage points. So the argument about gender is an important one, but it does not take the place of making arguments about racial equity. In terms of talking points, one of the most important things is to actually make it clear that what is being talked about is affirmative action. If you see the actual language, affirmative action is not mentioned. It says we are eliminating racial discrimination and racial preference. Well, everyone's against racial discrimination and racial preference. The million-dollar question is, what is a racial preference? So a lot of people who support affirmative action vote for it because they think they're voting against nepotism. They're voting against old boys networks. They're voting against preferences, right, that make equal opportunity difficult. Why is this the case? There have been polls and polls and polls that have been done since the early 90s that say when Americans are generally asked, do you support affirmative action? Not when they're asked, do you support preferences and quotas? A majority to a plurality tend to support affirmative action. If you ask them, do you support racial preferences, the vast majority say no. So the million-dollar question is, are the programs preferences or is it affirmative action? So I'll give you a case in point. In California, one of the major programs that actually created opportunities for women and minorities in businesses was simply a program that required primary contractors to show that they had made the bidding process accessible to minority and women businesses. They didn't even have to show that they gave them the contract, but there just has to be a record that the contracts were let not through the old boys network, but that notice had gone to a broader range of minority and women-owned businesses, right? Is this a preference? Is it a preference to open up and make sure that all the people in the market who could compete for these jobs get notice of it? Right? Most people don't see that as a preference, and they certainly don't see it as a quota. Ward Connerly and his organization saw this as a preference. So those programs have been eliminated. As a consequence of that, the percentage of contracts that were won by women and minority businesses plummeted, right, to less than 6%. And when we're talking about 6%, that doesn't give you a sense of what we're talking about. We're talking about billions of dollars worth of contracts, right? So these arguments about what is a preference, you have to force people to define what they are talking about. Most people have stereotypes about what they think this means. You have to be clear about what those programs are. The last thing is you have to be clear that when people are voting for or supporting the American Civil Rights Institute, they're not supporting Dr. King's civil rights organizations. And it sounds sort of like, well, gee, shouldn't people know this? When we were in Michigan, the last week before the election, we would go to churches and synagogues, those who we had reason to believe the constituencies there were supportive of equal opportunity, to talk about, to remind them that this was coming up. At the end, they would all say, so we should vote for the Civil Rights Initiative, right? Like, no, you're voting against it. It's hard for people to wrap their heads around. Civil rights? Isn't that about rights? It's about access. It's about giving people opportunities. It's about opening up institutions, not closing them down. So this has been a very effective strategy. And so once again, it's important to pull out what's behind the civil rights, who are the people behind it, what are the agendas, just so people have enough information so they can be clear about their choices.
Professor Crenshaw, on behalf of the University of Utah, the Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee for 2011, we certainly want to thank you. And this is a small token of our appreciation, but we just want to thank you for your kind words and the things that you said. I believe that all of us have learned something today and are ready to move forward in the things that we need to do. So thank you so much.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much. As we leave our
We want to say thank you to each of you for joining us this afternoon, and we have several other programs throughout the week, but we want to again say thank you to Dr. Crenshaw, and thank you. Have a good afternoon. And this will be playing as you go out, the clip.
Thank you very much. Thank
That was really interesting. Thank you. And I might see you next year at UCLA.
you.